So here we are. Welcome to another episode of Implications of Exponential Technologies. This time from two very fun places, very far away from New England in the United States and Berlin in Germany. And I'm today with Jennifer to talk here about wealth and intangible assets. So thank you so much, Jennifer. For me, it's late afternoon. For you, it's depending on your sleeping cycle, early morning or early afternoon. So there's like different preferences for people. And thank you for joining me for this beautiful conversation around wealth and intangible assets. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you, Robin, for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here. And you're right, it's about 10 a.m. my time, which I've been up since 6. So it falls somewhere in between morning, I guess mid-morning, on my way to afternoon. So it's a sunshiny day here, and it's such a pleasure. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, me too. And I think like this topic that we have chosen here is for many people in the first place, like what has this to do with exponential technologies, wealth, invisible wealth, and intangible assets? Where's the link here? So probably, Jennifer, just to get started with some fun and easy, difficult opening questions. What's wealth for you, actually?
Easy, difficult questions. Yes, I love that. And you make a really good point, because a lot of times people might look at the words exponential technology and wealth and think, well, wait a minute, or invisible wealth, like what is this person talking about? And it's funny because last month I did an event at Microsoft Garage. And Microsoft Garage is Microsoft's innovation hub. They have many, but one's based out of New York. And the guy who runs that location is wonderful, magnificent, incredibly brilliant. And his name is Mike Pell. And I'm getting to your question, but his name is Mike Pell. And he wrote a book last year called Visualizing Business. And of course, I wrote a book last year as well called Invisible Wealth. And so what we did is we did an event at Microsoft Garage, and we discussed the intersection between the two. So essentially, he's technology guy, I'm wealth girl, and like, how do these two worlds mix? And admittedly, you know, people might be sitting in the audience, whether it was at the Microsoft event or now, thinking to themselves, like, where is the intersection? And when I was at the Microsoft event, one thing that I opened up with is, and I think this is quite fascinating, is that the word wealth, or my book, Invisible Wealth, is much to do about redefining wealth. So what does it mean when we're talking about redefining wealth? Well, it means we're looking at the definition of the word in order to innovate and iterate on the word. And so here's the thing. Words, or the written word, is the oldest technology that we have, which is incredibly fascinating when you think about it this way. And it's an invented technology, and it's a collective technology that we use to communicate with one another. Or to put it in technology speak, it's what we use to communicate with one another between nodes, right? So you're in Berlin, I'm over here. We're both nodes using words to communicate and share information, which is incredibly fascinating when you think about it from that lens. And so words are arguably the oldest technology that we have. And sometimes we need to update our technology, which we all well know. And that includes the updating of our technology as it relates to the words and their definitions. And so invisible wealth is a lot about redefining wealth for this next generation of technological advancements and societal shifts, and what that means for language and how we interface with the concept and definition of wealth. So to answer your question, what is wealth? Well, in my mind, we're wealthy when we have an abundance of what we value. And so that's kind of the premise that I operate from. And I think oftentimes people think about wealth, they think about money, not wrong. But actually the word wealth came into our lexicon in the mid-13th century from England, from the root well, W-E-L-E, which meant health and well-being. And so wealth found its definitional roots in health and well-being, but over time it became synonymous with an abundance of money and material possessions. And there are evolutionary reasons for that. But now the invitation is to think about wealth more holistically, more multidimensionally, and to encompass this idea that we're wealthy when we have an abundance of what we value.
I love that. There's like so many substance already now to go into so many different directions to explore this further. Like I was like smiling because like a second ago when you were like talking about like also well-being, the W in the background of your background was like covered, and it could also be like health in a way. So that was like the very close connection there. So and I think like the word itself, like as you rightly said, like expresses already is so much. And I really like this perspective that you brought to the table, saying like, hey, what does it mean for a new society if I just like use this very simple definition here that is now currently unfolding, or that's currently developing based on different kind of shifts that we see all around the world happening, not only from technological advancements, but all different kind of other factors that are going in there. I think like technology is like really challenging us also on this aspect. And if you just like come at this point that you mentioned about like well-being as like the original definition of that, I think we see this question quite heavily being asked in a lot of organizations as well, especially when we're looking into technologies like artificial intelligence, where we always come around the corner and say, oh, everything will be replaced by technology. That's for another discussion. So I don't want to open this jar right now, because otherwise we will get lost. But there's also like this question, what's like the human contribution factor to work? What do we get back out of that? And I think that resonates in a certain degree also to what you were just describing. So like, what is actually this wealth's meaning for us? And probably can talk a little bit about that first. And then, I mean, we have like the intangible assets also in our title. We keep this for the second part there. So how would you describe like this new wealth? I mean, you have written a whole book, and I don't want to challenge you now to sum this up in 2 minutes, but just like from the core aspects, what would you say like it's like the new wealth, or the invisible wealth that we should see here?
Yeah, it's a really great question, and obviously one that I've thought a lot about. So thank you for the question. So again, when we think about invisible wealth, and I'll lay this nugget of thought, which we can get back to on the second half of our conversation. But when we think about invisible wealth is invisible rather, is another word for intangible. So I could have named the book Intangible Wealth, and it would have been one and the same in a sense. But I picked invisible because I think it sounds a lot cooler. But that aside, when we think about intangible assets and this blossoming interpretation of wealth, where people are thinking about wealth, and as you mentioned, as it relates to work, how are we optimizing our relationship with value at work? And what does value creation mean in terms of what we're creating at work, while we're there? What purpose are we finding? And how we're balancing that with our health and well-being, to go back to the original definition of wealth. And so what we're seeing is this multidimensional interpretation of what wealth is. And that's exactly why I presented or created these 5 principles of invisible wealth, meaning that these are 5 principles which provide a framework for this concept, which is pretty abstract, admittedly. So we want to take this abstraction and bring it into action by virtue of these 5 principles of invisible wealth. And so then it begs the question, well, what are these 5 principles? And so I'll list them out so that you have concept of what they are. But the first is money and investment. The second is health and quality of life. The third is knowledge, status, influence. And the fourth is time, energy, and experiences. And last but not least, the fifth is relationship with self and others. And so when we think about how that all relates to work, for example, to go back to your comments, I think we're all searching for purpose in a way that really hasn't been online in times past. We're all searching for meaning, money and meaning, right? Profit and purpose, the qualitative and the quantitative. The two, we're taking a comprehensive look at what wealth is, honoring both sides of the proverbial coin. And so I recently wrote an article thinking about Thoreau's quote, like, gosh, now I'm drawing a blank on it, and Viktor Frankl's coming to mind. But many men lead lives of quiet desperation. Have you heard that quote? It's from his book Walden. No. And so it's like that question, or that statement rather, permeates the zeitgeist even from 1854, from when he wrote the book, because we're all still searching for this purpose. And how do we fulfill this by virtue of the work that we do? How do we find meaning in work? In other words, how does the means to the end to making money actually satisfies just the same as making the money in the end as well?
I totally love that. Like this structured answer also, like with this different dimensions to work on. I probably want to ask you a question now, looking a little bit at like also like professional past. I mean, you're like the mastermind of everything that comes to the mind when it comes to professional wealth management, from your track record and the companies that you have been working with, and like also we just look into like traditional business school when you have like courses on wealth management. Many of those aspects that you just like mentioned are almost never addressed in this context, and just like focusing on like this first dimension, which is the financial dimension. Do you see like also like a shift in this whole discipline already, like being more like tangible already, that people are thinking more about that? Or do you have the feeling that there's like now these two streams emerging that are looking differently at wealth? How do you see this like from an industry perspective probably as well?
That's a really good point. And so I'll say last week I was in Miami. Why was I in Miami in the end of May when it's 90 degrees out? Well, because I went there because JP Morgan Private Bank invited me to come speak on the topic of leadership and legacy, right? Particularly as it relates to next generation and wealth transfer. And so the reason I bring that up is because the redefinition of wealth is mapping onto the redefinition of wealth management. And so these industries are changing slowly but surely, right? But these are big behemoth institutions that have been around for a very long time. And what you see is that they're expanding their offering, they're expanding the conversation in terms of what they're talking with their clients about. It used to be solely about the numbers, but now it's shifting into the narratives that envelope our lives, right? And our relationship with wealth in a more multidimensional way. And so you do see these industries, and I use wealth management as an example because, of course, that's been my world for over a decade. You do see these industries changing because there's a demand, right? People actually want to talk about this more abstraction, and we're becoming more and more comfortable with the qualitative side of business. And I'm sure you see this all the time, and I would love your thoughts. Like, how is innovation happening where we're folding in a more qualitative aspect of things? And I'll say, to tie this to technology, because I think it's an interesting point, something I've been thinking a lot about, is that we have this move away from linearity, meaning we're going into an era of non-linearity, into creativity. And we're seeing that if we think about generative AI, for example, generative in and of itself, the meaning is to create, right? And so we're stepping away from a linear world into a more creative world, and creative is inherently qualitative. And we're using or leaning on words more so than numbers, right? So we're getting a little bit more, the equilibrium is being reached in a more elegant, balanced way by virtue of honoring, again, both sides of the proverbial coin, the qualitative and the quantitative. And you see that very much so in the wealth management world. What about you? I mean, the industries that you touch are incredibly fascinating. What are you seeing?
Yeah, I totally love this perspective of like this two streams that are unfolding, that you described in like the wealth management aspect. I think like the same applies to a certain degree in many other industries as well. And like if we just look into education, for example, I think education is a very, very interesting discipline when it comes to like the speed and the redefinition of what is actually knowledge, to a certain degree. And sometimes in some disciplines you have the feeling, now look at artificial intelligence, for example, you don't really need to go into depths anymore to be an expert, because things are moving so fast that with superficial knowledge you come to quite a good state of expertise, right? And people not even uncovering that you actually are really superficial with these topics due to the fact that everything is moving so fast. And then at the same time you have this really research driven people that are trying to shape the landscape, that still try to get into depths and working out on the things, working on the papers 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years. And then like people say, oh, it's already outdated. And I think we see this in a lot of like technology disciplines, especially not only AI, but if you think about blockchain, when so I was really active in the blockchain space very early on, also from an educational perspective. We've created, amongst others, one of the very first fully accredited blockchain program on this planet. And back in the days when we're like academics were looking at it saying like, yeah, that's not an academic program because it's not really based on research. And at the same time, the best research you had were actually kids with usernames sushi roll 45.8 and hot dog 28 on some kind of weird forums. describing how they solved this technologically speaking. That was like this irony that you had like in a certain degree, that things have been unfolding in a completely different direction, and people were like way more creative, way more thinking about like the problem statements rather about than the academic correctness to a certain degree. And I think this is like really coming from a lot of other perspectives. We look into leadership development, for example. There's like always like, oh, we have this problem with leadership, let's fix it with another course, let's fix it with another coaching, let's fix it with something else. But what we completely ignore sometimes is the question, like, is this human being even capable to be a good leader from where they are? And we have like so many like foundational problems there, like just like bad sleep, bad nutrition, bad physical activity, to name just a few. And then like say, okay, on the one hand side, we want to develop people into some kind of like high performing leader, but at the same time the foundation is not there. And I think like this is something that resonates probably also with the perspective you just shared on wealth in general. It's like, hey, you can have like the wealth in terms of financial resources probably, but there's more to that. And I think like this discovery of what is around those topics is something that is really relevant at the moment, because we see that there's apparently something missing to a certain degree in society, and probably that's a good thing that we're moving on with such things. Nevertheless, there's a lot of like traditional thinking still existing in these disciplines, and also like still a lot of like this traditional, I don't want to call legacy approach, that wouldn't be fair, but where we're still like trying to stick things into certain boxes because we're not comfortable with the fact that they're not really 100% fitting to a module that we had previously, but that we probably need to adapt to a larger extent. And I probably that's quite close to what you were describing and happening in wealth management, right?
Exactly. Yeah, it's this tension between thinking inside the box and outside of the box. And there's a lot of people, I gather that you and I are quite ones that like to traverse from inside and outside and kind of hip hop. And Sushi Roll 1262 or whatever his handle was might be one who's outside, right, where others, traditional academics, are on the inside. And I think that's really great. It's good to have a little bit of tension, right, because this is how we can flush out what the future looks like together, bringing to the table kind of this multidisciplinary approach, multi-perspective, and to figure out the best path forward. And one thing you mentioned about health and leadership and all the rest, it's like that's a really good point. And one thing that I often think about and talk about in talks is that assets beget assets. And what I mean by that is that there's tons of research, Robin, like tons of research and data. So the numbers are there. But when you are oftentimes the greater your financial wealth, the greater your physical health. And the reverse is also true. The greater your physical health, the greater your financial health. So these things support and fortify one another, as you were saying, right? How can you have productive leadership if you can't get 8 hours of sleep a night or whatever your body requires? So it's this optimization of health. And then we also see that in the realms of longevity. What is longevity? It's kind of like this hyperbolic approach to wealth, in a sense, health rather, in a sense. And so we're having all these kind of exponential approaches to various assets, thinking about health and how do we take the asset of health and make that bolster that in a really productive way. And you have all these people with their neuro hacks and brain optimization, and how can they update our own software similar to how we update computer software. And you see these themes happening in parallel, in the intersection, in the convergence. It's incredibly fascinating, the times that we're living in. It's like, I wish I could just get paid to read and think about ideas, because there's so much to take in, right? And I'm like a kid in a candy store because I'm such a nerd, and it's all so fascinating. So really, really great points. Yeah, it's the interplay between being in the box and outside of the box, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think like this point that you mentioned, it was like leave it to the candy store. I think like the candy store is getting bigger every single day, because there's like so many cool things that are being created, and there are so many new forms also of like wealth generation beyond like the monetary aspects that are unfolding. And we just mentioned a couple of things, and probably if we just look into the second part of our title for the session, the intangible assets, it's it's quite likely, and I would assume that a lot of people, like when they hear this term, they probably think, especially in nowadays times, about like blockchain related topics like token economies, or like probably non-fungible tokens or digital art and all these kinds of things as the intangible assets or like digital assets. But you were also mentioning already a couple of others that are probably not necessarily falling into this specific economic definition of an asset, but that are more related towards the individual human being, and like the outcome that we're expecting out of an asset, or what an asset can actually put us into a position. Like one that I really liked that you mentioned is like this relationship between in this context, like physical health and then the wealth generation that's falling out of that, and vice versa, which probably makes a lot of sense now. The irony probably sometimes is like, how do you come to this point where probably have like these flywheel effects as well, right? Where one actually affects the other one positive, and there's probably some kind of like new form and new economy also emerging with those intangible assets that really lets people participate to a certain degree also in wealth creation in monetary terms that hasn't been available before, because it sometimes, well, let's be honest, right? The world is still functioning with financial terms, so if you're not participating, it's really hard to get something out of that. So how do you see this for like, is there like a more democratized approach now to wealth generation? Can more people participate actually there, or are we really having a quite privileged discussion right now that many people are still like kept out of? How do you see that in general?
It's a really great question. So I'm going to take two of your points and kind of braid them together. So you mentioned kind of these economies coming online, being born out of things that we're prioritizing, i.e. health, i.e. the longevity market, right? The longevity market, I mean, at least for me, I wasn't privy to or understanding of what the longevity market was until, recent years. But because of everyone's fascination in technological advancements and societal shifts, we have this economy that's booming these days. Similarly, to fold this into the 5 principle framework, the principle of knowledge, status, influence. So you touched upon education, right? And the innovation happening as it relates to how we acquire knowledge and also how we use knowledge. Then we take a look at status and influence. And I think, sometimes status has this yucky connotation, but I think it's actually could be quite productive. And the thing with status and influence is that the value being placed, the qualitative value being placed on status and influence has economic viability, in the sense that we have influencers making money. You have technological platforms, i.e., Instagram, YouTube, and all the rest, that allow these creators to sit on the shoulders of these platforms, right? And to create content, to create a brand that they're actually able to monetize. And this is an intangible asset of influence, for example, that people are able to wield for economic utility, which is really fascinating. So I think that the way that we're thinking about value is fundamentally changing. And there's technology that enables this unlock, if you will, for us to actually monetize this reconstruction and redefinition of value. And you mentioned blockchain earlier, and I know you've done a lot of work there. So I'm curious your thoughts. How has blockchain in your mind kind of unlocked value for whether it's companies, individuals, or different ways of creating value and tapping into that value?
Yeah, love that. Happy to explore a little bit on that, and I think it also resonates. We actually have 2 questions coming in from our audience, and I want to pull both in. But like first one from Daniel, he actually asked about like how actually businesses can effectively integrate and capitalize on exponential technologies, right? And I think it really resonates with what you were just mentioning, because and I also love the fact that you were already distinguishing between value, wealth, and then I would add another one, product, because there's like so many different aspects to that when we're thinking of like the business dynamic behind that. And I think like when we think about like a lot of technologies, we're always talking to a certain degree about infrastructure that we can leverage then in order to create value, and this value then is expressed through products and services. And what I think is like pretty interesting with the whole idea around blockchain at least that's the way I'm looking at it. And I mean, I studied economics, I studied business. Like the cool thing blockchain enables organizations, individuals, or communities is to really build their own decentralized economies with their own economic incentives, with their own monetary policies. So like things that you normally had only with like the central banks and government structures, you can create this by yourself now through a technological tool that is actually transparent enough that you can even like build on trust, right? Or like you can make the trust obsolete, that everybody's playing fair because it's transparent. And I think like this perspective is pretty cool for businesses, and also like relating to the question that Daniel was just putting into the into the chat. Like really say now you have like a tool, an infrastructure tool, in this case namely blockchain, that enables you to build your own transparent economic principles where everybody can agree on the value of something that actually creates wealth for everybody. Because if we both agree on, hey, I'm good with, I don't know, baking a cake, and you have like this decentralized currency developed, and we both agree that if I give you the cake and you give me a couple of those tokens, then we have a financial transaction, then we have a value defined for that. And if I then can use these tokens again in order to get my supplies, then all of a sudden things can work. And for me, this was like a really powerful moment when we had like with Bitcoin. I mean, like everybody knows probably by now, Bitcoin, like next to all this, like everybody got rich with that kind of discussion. What I found like really cool is that communities on a non-governmental, non-regulatory environment actually agreed on that something that someone or some group of people created has actually a transactional value, which with what we can trade, right, by having a pizza for Bitcoins. That was really fascinating because nobody would have ever thought about that. And when I went to university, I know it's a couple of days ago, then people were still like saying, this is something that is impossible. And then all of a sudden it happened. And I think these powerful tools, like imagining new things, creating new economies, new economical principles, and new ideas of how we can actually exchange something is really building something valuable for not only people but also like for organizations, and opening up a completely new toolkit on how we can generate values through new products and services that might create wealth to a certain degree for people that couldn't be participating in that before. And I think I don't need to tell you that because you know much better than everybody else's. There's like certain investment asset class, and we can talk about this in a second as well, because it's the second question we have in the chat. There were like a lot of asset classes that were really good to create wealth that are not accessible for most people due to the fact that they're lacking this initial capital investment in order to gain the benefits out of them, right?
Yeah, all really great points. And I love that you highlighted this concept of consensus around value exchange, right? And so these kind of people who are becoming entrepreneurs, you're baking a cake, that's wonderful. You have your own business, fantastic. You decide how much you want to sell the cake for. Someone agrees to that purchase, right? It's a negotiation where you kind of, the market figures out what your cake is worth, and then the tool in which we use to pay for that cake, it's being explored right now, right? Our concept of money, just the same as the concept of wealth, is being explored in a really philosophical and practical way. And I think the two are inherently interconnected. But yeah, it's interesting to see micro entrepreneurs coming online, micro economies, microcurrencies, and the interplay between everything, and what that looks like if we map that onto the future, right? And how that can really have an impact on the way that we think about economies.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that's where we take like this question from Paula also in here, where she was asking, like, she's wondering what like the long-term implications of AI and blockchain in particular are on asset management and also the investment strategies. It's a little bit related to what we had before. Like we're saying, hey, you can create like these new economies, and you have now these infrastructures to build something. But I think like also when we think about like the technical side of like investments, right? Because like it's not like there's sometimes this romantic idea of like when it comes to investments and like the stock exchange and stuff like that, right? That there's a well-dressed man standing in a room screaming at each other and handing paper for money kind of things. But the reality is that 99% of that is algorithms doing something so fast that nobody even realized this, and just like trying to figure out where there's like at least a little bit of leverage from this kind of things. So like I think like with blockchain we talked a little bit about like that, what does it mean for asset management, probably also investment strategies. First of all, you can build something new, but how do you see this also like with AI? What does it mean for an individual, for a company, especially given the fact of this new definition of wealth? What should they do? What is their new asset management? What's their new investment strategies? Are they probably swifting them as well from like purely monetary decisions to like also more like this new wealth definition, right? How do you see that in general unfolding?
Dynamic question. And I'll say I've been outside of the wealth management advisor seat for 2 years now, which is absolutely wild because time just flies as I've been focused on invisible wealth. But what I will say is that AI, broadly speaking, and obviously this applies to the investment arena, it analyzes data, right? It has the ability to analyze data and to figure out trends. And so that's really productive and interesting from an investment standpoint, because of course, everyone's trying to figure out where the market is going and what to invest in for this reason. And so when you have AI as a tool, right, it's able to help people to minimize investment risk because you're armed with this data to then use to inform or guide the way that you deploy your money as it relates to various asset classes or market caps or whatever the case may be. And so I think it's leverage. And this is the thing, AI is leverage in every industry. And that includes the investment industry. And I use leverage as a play on words here, but it's actually quite true. I mean, this is the thing. Creators, for example, to go back to the creator economy, use technology as leverage. Investment houses use AI for leverage. And what we're seeing is that the sophistication and the knowledge related to investment decisions is becoming so much more amplified. And I think the efficiency within the market is going to increase considerably. Now, there's another aspect to the conversation, which is worth bringing up, is that a lot of people are thinking, what companies do I invest in? Like, what's the biggest AI startup? And this is also quite fascinating because things are changing so quickly, Robin, as you mentioned earlier, with your lens from education and whatnot and knowledge and what's relevant and its shelf life, right? Because things are changing so quickly these days. Similarly, it's fascinating because AI is changing so quickly. So it's like, it's hard to even invest in this space because things are changing and you almost can't even keep up, which is an interesting problem to have. But nonetheless, I think it will continue to act as leverage for the investment world, both from the investment management perspective on a corporate level, but also to the individual as well. And these tools will increasingly get implemented onto apps that you can download on your phone, and they'll be running in the background, AI optimization. As we see when you Google something right now, you say AI enhanced or whatever the words are, and this is going to become so much more prevalent, as I'm sure we all gather, and it's going to optimize nearly every aspect of our life if we choose to approach it that way.
I love that. There's like, I'm not sure how to end this conversation now because we're already 5 minutes over, and I still have like so much in my head that I would love to share. But I think that's a good sign that we probably have a follow-up one on that one, because like I really love like all these aspects, especially also like looking at it from. I mean, we started with the question of like, what are the implications of exponential technologies on wealth and like also the intangible assets? Where like this big detour, which I think is like really helpful to like what's actually the wealth that we're talking about. It's a completely shift probably in the perception from what most people would assume it is, or what we have defined it also from a discipline. So we just look into wealth management, asset management, all these kind of terminologies. There's always leaning more towards the pure financial aspects, but like I really love this perspective of like there's so much more to that we need to take into consideration, also from a historical perspective, but especially from a moving forward as a society perspective. And then also like saying, hey, we have these technologies and actually that can help us through the infrastructure, right, to actually achieve some of those aspects. So some we haven't really talked about yet, so that we can look into this in the next session then probably. But like really saying like, hey, we need this redefinition, we need this new understanding of wealth, use infrastructure like AI, like blockchain, what have you, to really create value and these intersections with new products, new services, and this new understanding that then can actually create wealth for the individual, for organizations, and then also like for the strategies involved in that. I really love this this storyline that we had here. Jennifer, as we're at the more or less the end of the session, like normally the last question I always ask is there anything that we forgot that needs to go out of your head right now that you need to share? Otherwise, I can only say like so much. Like a big thank you for the session. It was really, really insightful, and I really enjoyed that.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me. This was a lot of fun. And I love that we touched on so many different facets and aspects of conversation. And that's the thing, these conversations are so dynamic because of the convergence of all topics these days. And, you know, we can unpack any part of this or a follow on to this with pleasure. In terms of anything that wants to jump out of my brain right now, no, I think we've covered a lot, and I really appreciate your time and the questions and your insights.
Then thank you so much, Jennifer, for your time. You have a whole day in front of you. I only have the evening in front of me, which is fair or unfair, depending on how you want to look at this. Thank you so much for spending this half hour with me, and I'm looking forward for our next conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming in the future.